Next up, Ivan Hill. He was born in 1961. He's a serial killer who killed at least 9 women from 1979 to 1994, and he was sentenced to death in 2007. They might have smoked his ass already. Eric Houston, who was born in 1972, he's a perpetrator of the Lyndhurst school shooting spree that left 3 students and a teacher dead. He was sentenced to death in 93, the subject of a made-for-television movie, Detention, The Siege at Johnson High. Y'all might need to check that out. Next up, Brian Hoyt. He was born in 79, and he was an associate of Jesse James Hollywood, convicted of the murder of Nicholas Markowitz, sentenced to death in 2003. Just a brief history. Jesse James, he was a weed man. Someone owed him money. He couldn't get a hold of that person, so he got their brother, took the brother to Palm Springs, made the brother dig grave, killed the brother, and that's who Jesse James Hollywood is. Might do a story on this guy. Next up, Michael Hughes, a serial killer who killed at least 7 women from 1986 to 1993. He was sentenced to death in 1998. Next, we have Imris John, Tyrone Miller, and Keyshawn Sykes, former Marines convicted of torturing and murdering a couple. Man, in 2008, all 3 were sentenced to death, while 4th accomplice was sentenced to life. You know why he got life? Because he snitched. All 4 of them were scummy. Next up, Randy Kraft. He was born in 1945. He's a serial killer who was convicted of 16 murders and suspected of 51 others. He was sentenced to death in 1989. Yeah, he was a habitual serial killer. Next, Gunnar Lindbergh. He stabbed a Vietnamese man to death in a racial motivated attack and sentenced to death in 1996. Yeah, Gunnar, you're weak as hell. Oh, racist ass. We don't need you down here on Earth with us, player. Next up, Franklin Lynch. Convicted serial killer and robber who was suspected in the murders of 13 elderly women in East Bay during the summer of 1987. He was only charged for 3 murders and was sentenced to death in 1992. Yep, well, damn. R.I.P. to those ladies. Next up, Jarvis J Masters. He was born in 62. He's convicted and sentenced to death for participating in the murders of a correction officer. He was sentenced to death in 1990. Next up is, hold on, Timothy, what's this dude's name? Next up is Timothy Joseph McGee. He was born in 1973. He's part of the Toonerville 13 and is a member believed to have shot at least 12 people between 1997 and 2001 in an attempt to kill 2 LAPD officers in an ambush, sentenced to death in 2009. Next, there's a YouTube video on him too, on this page coming soon. Charles Chase Merritt. He murdered the McStay family and for financial gain sentenced to death in 2020. Next, Andrew Mickle, born in 1979. He shot a police officer to death at a gas station. You know what happened to him? You could guess it. He got sentenced to death in 2006. Michael Morales. He's convicted for the brutal murder of Terry Winchell. You know what happened to him? Yep. That's what happened. He got sentenced to death. 1983. Joseph Nassau. Serial killer who raped and murdered at least 6 women. He was sentenced to death. He needed that. And Charles N.G., he's a serial killer who tortured and murdered 11 people with Leonard Lake. He died by cyanide after arrest in 1985. And NG was extradited from Canada to the United States and sentenced to death in 1999. Next up, Raymond Lee Euler. He's convicted of setting the Esperanza fire that claimed the lives of 5 firemen. He was sentenced to death in 2009. Gerald Lee Parker. He was a serial killer and rapist who killed at least 6 women and an unborn baby. He was sentenced to death in 1999. Just spit on his grave. Scott Peterson, convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, Lacey, and their unborn child, Connor, in a much publicized trial. He was sentenced to death in 2005, and He was later resentenced to life without parole in 2021. I think they should put it back to the other sentence. That's more fitting for him. Next up, Cleo Prince Jr. He's a serial killer who raped and murdered 6 women in San Diego in 1990 and was sentenced to death in 93. Next up, David Allen Raleigh, security guard who kidnapped and tortured teenage girls, killing one of them, sentenced to death in 1988. Next up, Raymond Salazar. He was convicted in 1989 of 7 murders, including 6 relatives and his boss, and he was sentenced to death in 1990. Vincent Sanchez, the Simi Valley rapist. He was convicted of 75 counts of first-degree murder charge, felony kidnapping, burglary, rape, and other sex offenses charges against numerous victims. He was sentenced to death in 2003. Wesley Shermantine, what a fucking name. One half of the Speed Freak Killers. Oh, man, he must have did hella drugs. Killers duels, believed to have killed as many as 70 people. He was sentenced to death in 2001. His accomplice, Lauren Herzog, she committed suicide in 2012. Mitchell Sims, he was born in 1960. He was convicted in May 20th, 1987 of the hotel room murders of a Domino Pizza delivery man, John Harrington, in Glendale. Of all places, Glendale. He also sentenced to death in South Carolina for the murders of 2 Domino's employees in that state, sentenced to death. The dude had a thing with pizza delivery people or something, apparently. Next up, Maurice Solomon Jr. He was a serial killer convicted of murdering 6 women in Sacramento, sentenced to death in 1992. Next, Carrie Stainer, serial killer convicted of killing 4 women in Yosemite. He got sentenced to death in 2002. William Suff, he was a serial killer convicted of murdering 12 women in Riverside County. He was sentenced to death in 1995. And last but not least, this is a surprise one. The well-known rapper Mozzy, he was sentenced to San Quentin. He served a few years at San Quentin for, just for having a gun. But he did a few years. And that concludes this episode. And I would just appreciate more feedback on how I can improve the channel. And yeah, everybody, stay tuned. We got more stuff coming. I appreciate y'all for watching.